Is organized religion bad? And if not, why does it cause so much suffering? And why does church matter so much? And what is church anyway? These are the questions that we're going to seek to answer on today's episode of Luke Up. Welcome to the show. I'm Luke. And these are difficult questions that I think, honestly, many Christians and non-believers alike through the centuries have grappled with. It seems especially prevalent in our culture today, as until very recently, people in my generation, particularly millennials, have drifted away from the church, largely because their parents, who are largely boomers, um, did not instill in them a sense of reverence. For more on that, see episode 1. But people have a big problem with organized religion. In fact, those two words together are almost taboo, almost a dirty word in our modern culture. And it's not without cause. So, as Christians, we believe that the church broadly, big C church, not your local denomination, but believers everywhere, are tasked with the monumental responsibility of representing Christ to the world. And lest we forget, I think we should all bear in mind that Christ himself was not popular during his time on earth. In fact, he made himself so immensely unpopular that the religious leaders of the day persecuted him and had him killed, when they were the very ones who should have recognized that he was who he said he was. Well, does that mean that the whole practice of organized religion is bunk? It failed to recognize the Messiah. Or does it mean that we live in a fallen world, as we discussed last week? And as Frank Turek says, when someone plays Beethoven poorly, you don't blame Beethoven, you blame the player. My contention is that, and as I will defend through a series of points in this episode, my contention is that there's always somebody playing Beethoven better. There is always a church or a Christian that is playing Jesus better. Now, we have focused a lot in this podcast on ecumenism, on reaching across the aisle as Christians and trying to unite around the gospel rather than divide over so-called third order doctrines. And we've also talked about what is worth dividing over. In episode 2, we talked about the things that do divide people, the things that should divide people, and the things that should not divide people as Christians. Now, if you're not a Christian, this all may be meaningless talk to you. You may be looking at the whole practice, at the whole rotten enterprise as you see it, and you see flawed humans failing to behave perfectly as their Lord and Savior commanded them to. Jesus said, "Be therefore perfect." Well, why did Christ give us an impossible command? Was it to prove a point? Or was it to set us on the course of striving for something that we cannot attain on our own, and thereby teaching us that we need Him to do it? Well, if you've made it this far and you're not a Christian, I hope that you will stick around, because I'm sure that you have some bitterness somewhere towards the Christian faith, whether that is an individual person that you knew that was all gung ho about going to church, and then were not, that person was not loving and was judgmental and rude and selfish and just really not bearing the image of God. Or whether you come from a certain faith tradition that has alienated you because of how you see it as being carried out. And maybe you would like to participate in a church. Maybe you would like to believe in the gospel. And people seem to be putting up roadblocks for you. Well, hopefully we can try to tear some of those roadblocks down and understand what the church's function is. We're going to also talk honestly about where it has failed, because I do think that's important. And we're going to talk about where we go from here, why it matters. The 4 questions that I opened the episode with, I think are all important, but they have to be answered in order. So we're going to start with the first question. Is organized religion bad? Now, this is a loaded question, and we're going to break this up into 3 parts. I'm not a preacher, but I do like a 3-point. I don't know that you would call this a sermon so much as a lecture, but the 3-pointer seems to work pretty well for us in this show. So we're going to stick with it for now. So the way that we're going to tackle these questions, we're going to talk first about the importance of the church, and I'm going to make the case for why it's important. We're going to look at the failures of the church and just be open and honest about where the church has failed historically and in the present day. And when I say historically, I mean we're going to be going much further back in time than you might think. And then we're going to talk about the perseverance of the church and how we should view it as Christians moving forward, looking beyond all of the things that we get mired down in when we deal with church matters, when we talk more about church than we do about God. Those barriers that people rightly perceive. We're going to talk about getting past those barriers. But first, let's answer the first question. Is organized religion bad? Now, what is religion? I suppose it would help to even answer the question if we had a definition of the thing that we are trying to assess the value of. So, what's religion? The best definition that I have heard, which is not from Merriam-Webster or Google, is from the political commentator Michael Knowles, who's a Catholic. And he says that religion is a habit of virtue that inclines the will to give to God what he deserves. I think that is a very apt definition when you really break it down. It's a habit of virtue, meaning it's not an abstract thing that you just sort of feel. Like, yeah, I kind of believe that maybe there's a God, and yeah, maybe Jesus died for my sins, and I just kind of feel it, man, and it's just like I'm just feeling it. No, it's not an abstract thing. It is a habit. You have a habit of virtue. In other words, there are concrete things that you do to place yourself closer to God. Well, it inclines the will. We talked about last week how sin darkens the will and darkens the intellect. Religion, true religion, I'll add that caveat. Um, if it is a false religion, then you're not actually succeeding at the aims stated here. But assuming that it's true, it's aimed at inclining the will toward God. So we talked a few weeks ago about reverence, about how we ought to orient ourselves properly toward God. How A.W. Tozer said that what you think of when you think of God is the most important thing about you. I just wanted to bring that back up because uh, that is so true and really should give us pause for reflection. Even when we think we're settled, there's always further that we can reach out. There's still this chasm between us and God, and we can always be trying to reach across it and just grab closer at him, like the sick woman in the crowd who just wanted to grab the hem of Jesus' cloak. We should be reaching out for him like that. So we want to incline the will toward God. We want to remove the sin that has clouded our will, and we want to actively pursue God. And the end of that aim is to give to God what he deserves. Well, what does he deserve? He deserves the natural outgrowth of himself. I made the contention last week that in the same way that God is truth and he is good, that these are not mere qualities, that these are aspects of him that we can reflect imperfectly. They are not just qualities that he has, he is those things. And I made the contention that he is glory. So when we glorify God, we are just returning back to him what's already his. He created our entire universe from nothing. Now, my dad and I have a slight disagreement about what he made the universe out of nothing, or what he made the universe out of. I would contend that he made it out of nothing, or as uh, the traditional Latin saying is creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. That there was no stuff. He didn't even like take it out of himself and make creation. He just spoke and it was so. That's a power that only God has. So when we glorify God, we are just returning back to him what's already his. So religion is a habit of virtue that inclines the will to give to God what he deserves. Now that we've defined religion, we need to assess why it ever became organized in the first place. Now, when you look at other world religions, you can most oftentimes discern a human motive. When you look at the barbaric religions, say, of the Native American tribes, particularly in South America, but really all over the Americas, the primitive religions that they had, um, they were aimed at power. Religion was a tool, particularly if you look at the example of the Aztecs. Religion was a tool of power, whereby people that wielded, and there was no separation of church and state, they were fused together. And so powerful officials that wielded the two-edged sword of church and state elevated themselves to these positions of power. And so it was self-serving. They perpetuated their own religious class. So what's different about Christianity? Well, you can look at the religion that our faith was born from, and you can easily see how the Pharisees, the Jews that were in power at the time that Christ came to earth, you can see how they were elevating themselves. They were using religion as a power structure. Now, God never designed it that way. In fact, Jesus explained that he did not come to overthrow the law, but to fulfill it. So they had missed the point. Now, I need to decide what order. I've picked out a handful of Bible verses, and I'm still playing with the format here of, I still prefer reading from my physical Bible. There's no substitute for that. Let's just go ahead and read the Bible verse of the day. I think this would be a good place to insert that now that we're 16 minutes into the episode. So this is going to come from the book of Romans. Now, side note here. You know how I like to take tangents. If you are a new believer, or even if you're just interested in what Christians believe and you don't have time or you don't have the inclination to read the whole Bible, my hope is that as Christians, as we mature, we have a stronger desire to read through the Old Testament. Our church Sunday school class has been reading through the book of Isaiah, which is dense, but oh man, does it ever have law and gospel just intermingled all throughout. But as introductory texts, I would say new believers and people who are just interested in learning about what Christians believe. There are 3 books that I would recommend, which are incidentally my 3 favorite books of the Bible. The Gospel of John, which speaks to the deity of Jesus Christ. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's John 1. So you get an understanding of the Word, the Logos, the divine logic of the universe being made flesh. So read the Gospel of John, read the book of Romans, the first epistle that is listed in order, and the order in which it's assembled in most Bibles. Paul, who himself was a Jew and a religious leader who persecuted Christians until he had a miraculous vision. And that's a whole separate story we could spend a lot of time talking about, and maybe will at some point. But Paul understood probably better than anyone how all of the Old Testament law, with all of its strictness and prohibitions and requirements, was setting people up to be prepared for a universal savior that would come first to the Jews, who were basically like the priestly class of the entire world. They failed miserably at it. God had always planned from the start, though, to send his son and make the religion that was initially reserved just for adherents to the Jewish faith accessible to everyone. Paul understood this better than anyone. And he, when he traveled around, would go to synagogues first to convince the Jews, hey, the Messiah that you've been waiting for, he came here. He was here. So you don't have to wait anymore. You can just believe in Jesus, and there's your answer. And that was convincing to many of them, but it also earned him a lot of negative attention. from the Jewish authorities and also from the Romans. But the book of Romans is very expository in terms of how the law taught us what sin was. We talked about sin a lot last week. The law taught us what sin was, but it never gave a perfect mechanism. It gave a way of exchange where the blood of animals could be traded, their death could be traded for ours, so that we didn't, well, for the Jews, people who actually practiced the faith. But it was never a perfect sacrifice. They had to keep coming back. But with Jesus Christ, one sacrifice was sufficient to pay for all of that debt that the law taught us that we have. So Romans is great for that. The third book I would recommend, so John, Romans, I would recommend the book of Hebrews. It's very dense. I would probably read it last after reading John and then Romans. But the book of Hebrews really hammers this home in terms of Christ's role. And there's some interesting metaphors and that really help to flesh it out. So I hope you will consider reading those three. But now that we're 21 minutes into the episode, we're going to read our Bible verse of the day. So last week we were also in Romans. I think you can tell that I'm partial to it. Now we're going to jump ahead a little bit. We were in Romans 6 last week, and we're going to be reading Romans out of Romans 10, specifically Romans chapter 10, verse 14. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? How will they believe in him whom they have not heard? And how will they hear without a preacher? It goes on to say, how will they preach unless they are sent? So what he's talking about there is, well, it's organized religion. We talked a couple weeks ago about divine revelation and how you can't just look at nature and find Christ hanging on the cross. It gets you part of the way there. Nature will resonate with Genesis 1. And if you believe in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, the rest of the Bible is at least possible. But you have to, it's a big leap. A lot of people never make it to the second part. A lot of people believe that maybe there's some type of God that made everything. But getting to the full point of the Bible, that is hard to swallow. That's why Paul in 1 Corinthians talks about not preaching with convincing words of wisdom, but with the Spirit, with divine revelation, which comes in many forms. The primary form is the Bible, which, well, I'll make that point later. God has given us his word in written form through the inspiration of many different authors. And you can test the writings of several books of the Bible against each other, and they will hold up. But the bottom line is Paul was a big believer in preaching. Okay. So the Bible says you need to preach the word, because that is how people hear, and hearing is how they believe, and believing is how they call upon Jesus Christ, and that is salvation. Okay, well, you still have a problem, because in our modern age, the church has become very balkanized. And what I mean by that is, because of our conception of the separation of church and state, which is like made up, it's totally fake. That is not enshrined in our Constitution anywhere. It is a myth. It is an offhanded comment that Thomas Jefferson made in a letter to a friend. And he was talking about his concern about the state imposing itself on the church, not the other way around. So, hot take, separation of church and state is fake news. Not to say that theocracy is the way to go, um, just to say that, of course, our religious faith and our political views cannot be separate. That's a topic for a whole other episode. The point that I really want to hammer home here is that, uh, like I said, church is balkanized. There's a brick building, or there's like a upscale modern building, and that's where you go and you do church, and then you go home. And it's like you go to church, and then you also have your home stuff and your work stuff, and never the twain shall meet. But it's not supposed to be that way. Um, we have a model of what the early church looked like. And I think this is great, but it also gets us confused. So I also want to read from the book of Acts, which is right before the book of Romans. This is in Acts chapter 2, verse 42. They were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone kept feeling a sense of awe, and many wonders and signs were taking place through the apostles. And all those who had believed were together and had all things in common. And they began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all, as anyone might have need. Day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house, they were taking their meals together with gladness and sincerity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord was adding to their number day by day those who were being saved. Hallelujah. That sounds wonderful. But here's the problem. It's not the first century anymore. Now, that may be offensive to some people. And I'm not saying that they were doing something wrong. That was the time in which they lived. The gospel was new. People hadn't heard it. There was no Episcopal church down the street that you could go drive up to and check it out. This was a radical concept that was transforming the Middle East. And so people had no choice but to gather in this way. And what Christ taught and what Paul continued to teach and Peter continued to teach, it was radical. I said Paul, but really at this point in the story of Acts, Paul was still Saul and he was still persecuting Christians. So forget I said that. This is shortly after Peter has just preached at Pentecost, and they have had 3,000 people added to their number. 3,000 people. You're sort of seeing this right now in this revival that's sweeping over the country, and people just coming in droves to be baptized. And that's great. That is wonderful. But where do you go from there? Because, okay, everything's hunky-dory. There's all these people. They're coming together. They're sharing. They're caring. It's great. They're just working together. It's like kind of a commune thing. It almost feels like a hippie thing. Well, you have to remember that at that time, they lived in small communities. A town, the houses were like 10 feet away from each other, and they were all cloistered together. And so it wasn't that hard for everyone in the town to just gather up together and meet. Now, if you want to gather everybody in the town that I live in, there's not really a convenient way to do that. I live in a rural area. So everybody can't walk. We could drive and meet all at one place. But now the church has been so split up that there's not like one body of Christian believers. So we have all this dissension. And for more details on that, I really urge you to watch the second episode where we talk about denominations. But that's just the practical reality now. Even if there weren't denominations, so I think there's something like 1.3 billion people adherents to the Catholic faith. Well, imagine 1.3 billion people all living together, sharing their possessions, it would be anarchy. It would be chaos. You would have to have some type of administration to organize, like, okay, everybody just brings all their stuff into the town square. There's not a city on earth that can hold 1 billion people. It's unimaginable. So all the Christians can't just be together. And even if they were, they wouldn't agree on everything. There's no way. These people had no preconceived notions. They were hearing the gospel for the first time, and as far as they knew, there was only one way to do it. They had an advantage, in other words, that we don't have. We have the burden of living in the here and now. The good news, actually, the miraculous news, is that the church has persisted this long. I think he was French. The writer Hilaire Belloc famously said, "No merely human institution conducted with such knavish imbecility would have lasted a fortnight." And he was talking about the Catholic Church, and we'll talk about the failures of the church here in a moment. Um, Before we get to that, I want to read one more passage. And so we're jumping around a lot here. We're going to jump ahead to Paul's letter, his first letter to the Thessalonians, which we call 1 Thessalonians, chapter 5. Now, everybody knows verse 17, pray without ceasing. But the rest of the chapter, well, starting in verse 11 and going through verse 24. It's a lot, but just stick with me. You'll see where I'm going with this. So 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 11. Therefore encourage one another and build up one another, just as you also are doing. But we request of you, brethren, that you appreciate those who diligently labor among you and have charge over you in the Lord and give you instruction, and that you esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Live in peace with one another. We urge you, brethren, admonish the unruly, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with everyone. See that no one repays another with evil for evil, but always seek after that which is good for one another and for all people. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing. In everything give thanks, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. Do not quench the spirit. Do not despise prophetic utterances, but examine everything carefully. Hold fast to that which is good. Abstain from every form of evil. Now may the God of peace himself sanctify you entirely, and may your spirit and soul and body be preserved complete without blame at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Faithful is he who calls you, and he also will bring it to pass. So that section in chapter 5 in my Bible is titled Christian Conduct. And Paul is explaining how Christians are to interact with one another. This is not necessarily general advice for living. This is how Christians are supposed to behave. And he says, he talks about admonishing the unruly. So there is self-regulation suggested here. And he says to appreciate those who diligently labor among you and have charge over you in the Lord and give you instruction, and that you esteem them very highly in love because of their work. That's talking about having respect for pastors and church authorities. And of course, when you read that back to back with what we read earlier about how will they know unless it is preached, the importance of preaching the gospel is paramount. That alone is enough reason to support the importance of the church, because you're not hearing the gospel out in the world. You're hearing a lot of stuff. You're hearing Bad Bunny, performing graphic, sexually explicit shows for the Super Bowl. Not in English, thankfully. So we don't have to understand the filth. But that's what you're getting from the culture. You're not hearing the word. And this is really important. Church matters because it's true. C.S. Lewis said that I'm paraphrasing here, but he said that Christianity or the gospel is either the most important thing ever conceived. It should be something that consumes you and occupies your every thought, or it's utterly meaningless. He said the one thing we must not do is regard it as trivial or of moderate importance, I think is the way he put it. So it's either everything or it's nothing. Now, the world is pretty comfortable with saying that it's nothing until they realize that they have the problem of sin and they don't have a solution for it. So they want to steal our religion, but they don't want any of the truth. They want all the love and none of the truth, but it doesn't work that way. To get the truth, you have to have the church. And this is what church looks like. It looks like admonishment. It looks like encouragement. It looks like love, respect for authority, having a sense of order. In other words, you don't just want anyone, as I mentioned in a previous episode, you don't just want anyone walking in off the street with no education in the word, just making their own personal interpretations and just saying things that are so off base and blasphemous. You see this with people like Stephen Furtick of Elevation Church. I once heard him say, "I am God." I almost had to sit back from my computer in case lightning were to strike him with such force that it came over the airwaves and destroyed my PC. That's unimaginable. And we don't want that. We want good teaching, solid teaching of the word. And that's why church matters. Because if you're not teaching the truth, you're going to lead people astray. Our pastor talked about this past Sunday about the danger of leading people astray. And it is a grave responsibility. Jesus said that it would be better for a man if a millstone were cast around his neck and he were thrown into the sea than that he should cause one of these little ones to stumble. Little ones meaning immature or new Christian believers. Because not everyone's at the same point in their faith journey. I'm still growing, as we all are. That's what sanctification is. But we have to be on guard against the enemy. And so if you believe in the gospel remotely, if you profess yourself to be a Christian, don't let it be of moderate importance. You need to pick one. You need to pick a camp. And if your faith really matters to you, it should be a pursuit for you. Now, I think we've only answered the first question. The second question that I asked was, if organized religion is not bad, why does it cause so much suffering? So let's talk about the failures of the church. Now, everyone has their favorite examples: the Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades, uh, the sale of indulgences, which that's a big one for us Protestants. That's why the Protestant Reformation occurred largely. Um, but you have things like pedophilia within the church. But here's the big one, and this pertains to the title of this episode. And I'm talking about the H word. Not hell. That's not profanity. That's a real place. In fact, we should talk more about it as a very real place. No, I'm talking about hypocrisy. Okay, this gets bandied around a lot. And it begs the question, why is hypocrisy so bad? The French writer La Rochefoucauld famously said that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. What he means by that is that if you are hypocritical, at least you know there's a standard. You don't you don't think it's important enough to meet it, but you know that the standard matters. You're just like, well, everybody else has to follow this. I'm just whatever. For whatever reason, but you know the standard is there. Well, why does this bother people more than other sins? In other words, why are many Christians more bothered by the perceived, and I will say correctly perceived, hypocrisy of other Christians than they are about the sin that is running rampant in our world? Well, I have a suspicion that it's because, as with any hypocrite, we know that there's a standard and we know that we don't meet it. God is the standard. He gave us his law. He even came here to make his law much simpler for us. Uh, Christ said that the two greatest commandments are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And on these hang the law and the prophets. In other words, you can take all of the Old Testament law and boil it down to those two. And perhaps I'll do an episode on the Ten Commandments, and it's brilliant. This could only have been designed by God. How the Ten Commandments are structured such that the first three or four, depending on how you split them up, fall under that first category that Christ mentioned, to love the Lord your God with every fiber of your being. And the remainder are our relation to others. So how we love our neighbor. But I think this is the problem. I think we're all hypocrites. We all know that there is a standard that we are incapable of meeting. And so it rightly bothers us when we see it in someone else. Now, I've heard the joke, and I'm sure many of you have as well, that when someone says, "Oh, I just can't go to a church because there's too many hypocrites there." And the sort of tongue-in-cheek thing to say is, "Well, come on down, we got room for one more." And it's true, but I don't think that's going to really convince anyone, because I think most people are going to get defensive at that and say, "Oh, well, I don't claim to be good, but these holier than thou Christians, they act like they're so good, and but they're gossiping and sleeping around and all this other stuff." And they're not wrong. That's bad. Christians shouldn't be doing that. So stop. But here's the thing. We have the problem of sin to contend with. we're still stuck in these bodies. And as long as that's the case, until we shake off this mortal coil, we are subject to the three temptations of the flesh, the world, and the devil. So the church has essentially failed in the same way that humanity has failed, which makes perfect sense because the church is an institution that Christ left us to operate. Now, if you subscribe to Martin Luther's view of the church, and this would be another great topic for another episode, Martin Luther described what he called the three estates, or the church, the family, and the state, or the secular government, and that these each have different functions. And the way he described it was that the church came first. Broadly, the church just means man's relationship with God. And so God built the church when he created Adam and defined his relationship with Adam, what type of relationship that was going to be. And he created the family when he gave Adam Eve, and they were given instructions to be fruitful and multiply. And so there was a code that governed how a family was to operate. Well, because Adam and Eve sinned, they invented sin. I want to say it that way, um, which was a contradiction of God's design, their invention of sin, which the people of Israel would actually pretty much go on to perfect, and that we are pretty darn good at nowadays, is the art form of sinning. But God had to create something to deal with that. And so he gave us the state, or the earthly government, which Peter explains in, I think it's Peter, says that basically government was created for the punishment of evildoers. And it's a temporary fix. It's not a permanent. God's justice is perfect. But we have the civil authority, which, as the Bible says, does not bear the sword in vain, to enact some measure of justice that we can achieve in this life. So the church came before all of that other stuff. So if you like government, you should really like the church because it came first. And if Adam hadn't failed to perform his part of the church contract with God, government wouldn't have been necessary. James Madison famously said that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Well, if Adam had not sinned, no government would be necessary. And all we would have would be the church. Maybe this is not a satisfactory answer for some people. Uh, God observed after the flood when he destroyed the earth. Now, here's another topic of another episode, what you think that means in terms of regional versus global and the implications for geology. That's my background. That would be an interesting episode that would certainly step on some toes. I don't think I'm quite ready for that one yet. But God said after the flood, he observed the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. And he said that after he had just wiped out at least thousands of people and left only a small handful alive on the earth to repopulate the earth. And this is not like a realization that he's having. It's more like he's articulating it for us to understand. And so he decided that because that was just going to happen again, he wasn't going to continue just purging the earth every time people are sinning. Well, that's too bad now. I'm just going to wipe it out. Now, he did that selectively with, for instance, Sodom and Gomorrah, but not the whole creation. My point is that God has always desired to mend the relationship with us. And he created the church in order to do that. Now, the church was sort of, you could say that it always existed from Adam. It was given a form with God's covenant with Israel, with the Ten Commandments, with the Mosaic Law, which they then added on things to that God had not commanded them to do. And so that was, yet again, God's design being corrupted and refashioned by humans. And that's the real problem. I wish that people could see that the problem is not the concept of orienting yourself toward God. That's not what is wrong. We just are impossible of doing it perfectly. So we know all about the failures of the church. Let's look at the perseverance of the church. I lied. I have another passage that I want to read that I hadn't picked out. But it works out okay because I missed one. So I think it's a wash. So I did not prepare myself a sticky note for this one, but I know where it is. So bear with me. Cue the elevator music. Okay, this is going to be in Matthew chapter 16, verses 17 through 19. And Jesus said to him, he's speaking to Peter, and Jesus said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. I also say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven." Now, if you're Catholic, you take this and run with it in the direction of apostolic succession. That's not really what I'm setting out to talk about in this episode. The point is, excuse me, and I know we got to wrap this up again. This is how awesome God is. I come into this thing and I'm all nervous and I'm praying, God, let me have enough to say. I miss like 5 or 6 of the things that I've written down, and I end up just having more to say. God just makes all these connections happen. So I just all glory to Him. I'm very thankful that it works out this way. And I'm thankful to whoever has continued watching it to the 53-minute mark. We'll try to wrap it up soon, but I want to end this on a positive note. So I made the contention that the failures of the church are the failures of people. That is not unique to the church. You will find human fallibility everywhere you look. But we have some encouragement, because when Christ told Peter, who he was blessing because Peter finally got it. Peter, he often tried to be the best. He was like the overachiever in the class, but then he would just throw out answers that were totally wrong. But he really understood. And so this was in response to Peter saying, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." He was like the first one to get it, to really understand what Jesus was about. And so Jesus makes this promise that I will build my church upon you, meaning upon your leadership. So we started with the apostles. It was like the founding, the refounding of the church. Sort of like how America had a new founding after the Civil War, you could say. The church had a refounding with the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So he wasn't necessarily building something new. He was completing the work of man's relationship to God. And that's what the church is aimed at. So this is the main point, that the church endures because God sustains it. I read that quote from Hilaire Belloc that basically, imagine any other human institution that was run as poorly as the Catholic Church, uh, lasting for 2,000 years. And it's impossible to imagine. Governments rise and fall. The United States of America will not be here in 2,000 years. Governments rise and fall, but Christ's church perseveres. That's because it is not like other world religions, something aimed at just empowering people and propping them up to lord over others. Now, of course, people misuse it. You see pastors in many different denominations approaching the faith out of conceit and desire to build themselves up. Not build themselves up closer to God, but just over everybody else. That does happen. But that's not the function of the church. That is just I guess you could call it a feature or a bug. Really, it's a bug by virtue of the church having to exist in this fallen world. But here's the thing, we're not going to be in this fallen world forever. The church will be perfect in eternity. I just, my heart hurts for, truly, for people that have been harmed by other believers. And I'm not talking about somebody said something to you that was convicting. You know, we are called upon to exhort and to admonish one another. I think that was the term that Paul used in First Thessalonians, to admonish one another. You're not being loving if you don't correct someone that is living in sin. And so, if what you're looking for out of church is for your ears to be tickled, then don't even bother, because you and I don't believe in the same God. But if you believe in Jesus Christ, and if you believe that everything that he said was true, and everything written in the Bible is true, then I would urge you to consider maybe trying to get outside the hallway, to use a phrase from an earlier episode, the metaphor of the house of C.S. Lewis, that the denominations are rooms. I would urge you to try to get out of the hallway. I mean, the hallway is in the house. But even though the rooms aren't perfect, and there's always the family member in there that you have a disagreement with, just like at Thanksgiving, um, and there's always one of them that needs to get their lives together. The room itself is not flawed. The people in the room are flawed, but the room's not flawed. And so don't think of the church as, you shouldn't go to one of two extremes. You shouldn't think of it as just a building And you shouldn't think of it as just people. It's really a vehicle for orienting yourself towards God. Now, it's wonderful when you can surround yourself with people that are like-minded, when you can have a church that looks more like Acts 2. It's not really practical to look exactly like that because we live in a different day and age now where people are more spread out. People live differently. The way that we go about our daily life, we're not farmers. We don't work right outside our house. Our house isn't right next to the neighbor's house, and the neighbor's house isn't right next to the church. But the point is, Satan will attack the church however he can. It's like a divide and conquer strategy. It's not ideal that we are split up into all these denominations, but now that we're here, we really need to get comfortable in the rooms that we're in because there's a storm outside the house. And so I think we've answered all 4 questions. The questions I opened with: is organized religion bad? If not, why does it cause so much suffering? Why does church matter so much? And what is church? We definitely answered the question of what is church and why it matters. Now, as to why it causes so much suffering, that's a really simple answer. That's because people are sinful and people run the church, and there's no way around that. So I'm sorry, but that's just how it is. The good news is it still belongs to God. So even though we're kind of running it for him and we're doing a terrible job, all things considered, it's still his church. So whatever your problems are with the people or with the committee or whatever, I get it. Sometimes they're playing Beethoven really badly and it doesn't even sound like Beethoven. And if that's the case, go find somebody else to play Beethoven for you. That's fine. But let's all try to listen to it. And when we're listening to the same song, when we're reading the same book, when we are agreeing to the same thing in a liturgical church, we agree to it in the form of creeds. When we're all on the same page, that's the church. We don't have to agree on everything. We just have to agree that Jesus died for our sins and was resurrected, that he is the eternally begotten Son of God the Father, and we can figure everything else out. And we will continue to strive for that. That's why I'm here. But I urge you not to make the category error of looking at the Christian faith as like every other world religion. It's not. It's true. That's what makes it different. I think we're going to close there. Thank you for sticking it out with me. I don't know if you're watching this as late at night as I am recording it, but I hope this has been helpful. I'm Luke, not the saint, just a sinner, and this is Luke Up. Thanks for watching, and God bless.